Dear guests, good evening. Welcome to this seventh Joan Muysken Lecture. And let me start with a particular word of welcome to a few special guests. So first of all, of course, we have Johan and Annemarie here. That's great that they join us. And of course, we have an eminent speaker, that is Professor Wolfgang Streeck, who is sitting here and who will take the floor in a few minutes. We have our new dean, Marielle Heiltjes. I'm very happy that she also is present, and of course I'm very happy that the audience almost fills up this aula, so welcome to all of you. My name is Clemens Kool. I hold the chair in macroeconomics and international monetary economics here at the School of Business and Economics, and I'm also the head of the department in which my chair is located. It is a pleasure to host you tonight for this Joan Muysken Lecture. And the aim of this yearly event is to honor the work of Joan Muysken. Joan played a key role in building the school. He was the first professor of economics appointed at the school. He served as head of department, but also as dean, and he had many official and more informal functions here in the school. However, at some point everybody has to retire, so Johan had to retire, and we installed this annual lecture as a tribute to him. After the retirement, however, he remained active as a researcher. He's still here in the faculty 3 or 4 times a week, so I'm very pleased that he is also here tonight. And the research that Johan always did was to combine deep theoretical insights with applied research. And more in particular, he has always been very open to, let's say, policy implications and to non-orthodox, non-mainstream economic lines of thought. And the Joan Muysken Lecture tries to follow in his footsteps. So we always try to get somebody here as a speaker who has earned his reputation, expertise by doing work that is not only excellent but also is slightly away from the mainstream. And tonight, that is Professor Wolfgang Streeck. He's a well-known social scientist, and he perfectly fits, so I'm grateful that he is here. Before I start a few words to introduce Professor Streeck, I would like to extend also special thanks to Studium Generale and its representative, Jaap Jansen, because this lecture is made possible also with the cooperation started years ago of Studium Generale. And of course, the people who really did all the work to organize this, and then I'm thinking especially to Tom van Veen and Sylvane de Sanctis. But let me now introduce our guest. Professor Streeck is a German economic sociologist and emeritus director of the Max Planck Institute in Cologne. He studied sociology at the Goethe University in Frankfurt and at Columbia University. After his studies, he started his career as an assistant professor in sociology at the University of Münster and finished his habilitation in sociology at Bielefeld. From that point on, between 1988 and 1995, he worked as a professor of sociology and industrial relations at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And after that, he returned to Germany to take up the post of director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies and to work again as professor of sociology at the University of Cologne. He retired from the directorship in 2014, becoming an emeritus. His work is centered around analyzing the political economy of capitalism. He has written extensively on the political economy of Germany and more recently has involved himself in debates on the politics of austerity, the rise of what he terms the dead state as a result of the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s, and the future of the European Union. To the public, Professor Streeck is perhaps best known for his 2016 book, How Will Capitalism End? And in the book he shows that because contemporary capitalism is beset by 5 disorders: declining growth, oligarchy, starvation of the public sphere, corruption, and international anarchy — it won't get any merrier tonight — for which at present no political agency exists to confront them. And it will continue to regress, in his view, until at some point it might end. Well, we are still alive today, and in his spirit, Professor Streeck will give a lecture on Contradictions of Capitalism, Past and Present. The lecture will take approximately 1 hour. Now, normally then afterwards there is a Q&A here in this hallway, in the aula, but unfortunately Putin extends his arms even into Maastricht. Due to the energy crisis, we have to close the building by 10 o'clock, which means that we have decided to merge the Q&A with the informal reception. That is, I will close off when Professor Streeck finishes with a few words. Then we all move down to the place where drinks are served, and at that point everybody should feel free to ask questions to Professor Streeck. Professor Streeck, we are very happy to have you here in Maastricht, and we look forward to your lecture. The floor is yours. Please, come up.
Thank you very much. This is a first for me in that usually I give lectures before dinner. Now it's after dinner. It reminds me a little bit of the high table tradition in Oxford or Cambridge, where first you have lavish dinner and then someone gives a speech which sometimes sort of mishappens because they had too much wine. I tried to be very, very reluctant with the wine because the lecture is is difficult enough. I'm a sociologist who is not an economist. I'm a sociologist who is not so much interested in the micro level of society, individuals acting in society, but the macro level. Societies comprising acting individuals and interacting with them. Now, in particular, there are all sorts of societies, but the societies that I've been working on are modern societies. That is, societies with states and politics and formal institutions at their center. The economy in this framework is a social economy. It is historically and territorially specific, embedded in a specific society as both a field of institutionalized social action as well as a product of institutionalized social action. The economy, in other words, not as a machine servicing society, provided it is correctly maintained by economists like those here in this room. No, it is a battlefield in this framework, not a machine. The theory that is required for this is a historical and political theory, emphasizing change and conflict with open outcomes, as distinguished from a functionalist system equilibrium theory with outcomes basically closed. You know what it has to be like, at least, and then you do what you can in order to rectify the thing. You will see some applications of this general principle as I continue with this lecture. Before I do so, a word on capitalism. Now, capitalism is something that people always talk about, but they sometimes do not have a precise definition. I want to offer that definition because I think my definition opens up a particular view that might be intellectually productive. Capitalism, in other words, is a particular kind of a sociology, of a society, institutionalized, which originated in Western Europe during the transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern period, and from then on spreading around the globe. It has, in other words, territorial and historical specificity. Now, sharper definitions are the following, two of them. Capitalism is a mode of production geared towards the endless accumulation of capital, suitable for investment in the production of more investable capital. Yeah, is this sort of machine going on. Whereas a capitalist society is one whose prosperity and stability, you can also say whose well-being, depends on a successful capitalist economy. It is dependent on this. If you want to have good education in a capitalist society, the economy must produce capital. If it doesn't do that, then you can't afford anything. Adam Smith has, in 1776, pointed out that if the owner of stock, capital in his language, removes that stock from a particular country, then any activity is hopeless, dead, ended. Yeah? The dependence on the capitalist society is dependent on capitalism. Now, what I want to point out in this somewhat conceptually over-heavy lecture is what I could call the improbabilities of capitalism. Here the title is Contradictions of Capitalism, but that was when a year ago I was asked to invent a title, and this is what I had to offer. But I should have said the improbabilities of capitalism. And there are three of them that are important and on which I will elaborate in the course of the lecture. The first is the commitment, you can say the cultural commitment to, as a sort of ethic of economic behavior, to output maximization instead of input minimization, requiring the suppression of what I call the subsistentialist temptation. And that is probably like this. All over the world, people sort of used to conduct their economy on the principle of input minimization. They did just as much as they needed in order to maintain their current way of living. What Marx and Weber describe as the beginning of capitalism is another form of another goal of rationality. Now, first, the input minimizer sort of uses all rational calculation to make sure that they don't work more than they absolutely have to. They are, in other words, lazy. Today we call them lazy, but most people in the history of the world were all lazy, and we are sometimes also, I'll say something like that. And then comes this moment in which people's economic attitudes are revolutionized. Now it is, you have resources and you have to squeeze the maximum out of them. Output maximization. Both are sort of forms of rationality. You can apply mathematical calculus to both of these things. But what Weber describes and what Marx, I will talk about this in a few minutes. What they describe is this sort of unique change in economic ethic. That's the one improbability. You have to maintain this commitment. The other is, secondly, the social institutionalization of private ownership in a society's collective capital. Why should people who are working leave the capital that they produce to a small oligarchy, let's say 5% or 2% of the population? In other words, this class distinction. And the third is the third improbability is the question of the sustainability of the commitment to unlimited growth. This sort of endlessness of the capitalist perspective. That is also improbable because the world is finite, And we, however, in order to maintain a capitalist economy, have to maintain this idea that the sky is the limit, and beyond the sky, there's another sky. Yeah. So, my point is that these three improbabilities of capitalism are a source of continuous tensions, conflicts, and contradictions. They make the capitalist configuration fragile and crisis-prone and keep it in motion, driving its continuous transformation. I mean, if you look at the history of analysis of capitalism, then you see Lombard believes in the 1930s that capitalism has ended. Yeah? Because he saw something happening that he couldn't combine with what he thought was late capitalism in the 1930s. So each of the major theorists of capitalism, beginning with Marx and not ending with Schumpeter, expected that capitalism would end in his lifetime. In his lifetime. In my book, I say, if I'm wrong, I absolutely am in very good company. Absolutely. And all this, the reason why these theories are like this is because of these improbabilities. How can you maintain a system that is so strangely constructed around these three assumptions? So fragile and crisis-prone. That means that this configuration entails a historical political dialectic with no endpoints, with open outcomes. There's always something going on. And it is essentially historical in the sense that it is unpredictable. There's agency in it. We are not able to say. Imagine 20 years ago, could you have imagined sort of our communication systems? Absolutely impossible. We could not have predicted this. And we're looking at this, there's something going on here which escapes prediction. Yeah? And then that's the one sort of point of these improbabilities. And then the other is making capital possible against the odds, suspending its improbabilities, requires permanent creative intervention of states and governments, acting as managers of discontent and troubleshooters, as go-betweens, mediators, arbitrators. That means that without a state, capitalism can't exist. It is absolutely essential for it. Historically, the spread of capitalism in the world is associated with the states of, let's say, Genova begins, and then comes Amsterdam, then comes London, then the United States, all sort of maritime powers who were able to impose the capitalist logic on other parts of the world where it had to be imposed because it doesn't come naturally to people. Yeah? This is by way of introduction. And what I want to do now is walk you through 7 points. The concept of contradiction, then back to this behavioral program of capitalism as culture, using the Marxian analysis in Capital, Volume 1, on the origins of capitalism as my background. Then the role of the state in the management of the contradictions of capitalism, after which I would want to apply this logic to the sequence of crises that we observe since the end of the golden era, since the 1970s, in our developed societies. I use this crisis sequence thing in the book on buying time. This was written 10 years ago, and I had only 3 stages. Now I have 5 stages because things have have developed further. Then I would point to the fact that what we've seen in recent years is that there is, apart from all the change, something very strange going on in the fate of this economic system, and that can be briefly exemplified in the response or non-response of advanced capitalism to both the natural disaster, the deep penetration into nature, sort of hitting back, COVID, and then the final disruption of the international order that was after 1990 installed in terms of the so-called New World Order, the war, the end of political wisdom. Let me refresh myself, because at the end you will see a pretty sad picture. So be strong. It will not be pleasant. Contradiction. Just to suggest a few conceptual tools to deal with this. Contradiction is a configuration of forces or groups or purposes that cannot, for conflicts inherent in it, remain the way it is. Or contradictions generate dynamically unstable, temporary settlements beset with self-transforming internal tensions. So whatever you do, it will give rise to new problems. In short, solutions become problems. The analysis of contradictions, that is why this requires a historical perspective. One that can conceive of open-ended processes. That's a different perspective from a system perspective. A system has no history. A system has properties. This thing has a history. In other words, what comes next is not clear to what happens now. It's only that history works with the material that it has produced in the past and turns it into a future that is not predetermined. The processes driven by contradictions are political. Better? So, yeah. They are not functional, by conflicts, not by systemic needs. Disequilibrium is the term. I will now say something on the first improbability of capitalism as a social formation. In volume 1, Marx discusses after these first 4 or 5 sort of Hegelian chapters that nobody can really understand when you read them today. Then Marx begins. The economic historian begins to ask the question: when did this whole capitalism thing start? Because in order to have capitalism, you have to have capital. But where does the capital? And then the process generates the capital further. But there must be a moment, primitive, first moment, in which there must be some capital from somewhere. You have to find some. And then he points to various developments in the history of Europe, including, for example, the conquest of America and the bullion that you found there, that you could introduce in the European economy to create demand, for example, with the effect of creating demand. And then I'll go to this in the next step. Then. If this involves the turn from input minimization to output maximization, you could also say from sort of natural laziness to Protestant ethic, yeah, how can you maintain this? And what I will show is that there is an enduring subsistentialist temptation in our societies. People sort of always tend to think that at the present stage, I mean, why should they work more? They can basically live with what they have. But you have to explain to them that this is not an acceptable attitude and that they should sort of do something more. Marx then gives a long list of mechanisms that are needed to do this. As an aggravating condition, of course, the accumulation of the collectively produced capital takes place in private hands. On this a little more in a moment. Marx then, in the historical chapters of Volume 1, shows how various mechanisms were used in the history of Europe to re-educate people in a sort of, as Weber would say, Protestant way. We all sort of sometimes learn in our lives that people tell us, you have a talent and you must make the most of that talent. That is sort of the, whereas in the sort of more natural thing is, well, yeah, if you can live with it, then why should you exert yourself all the time? Yeah, but that's a different sort of logic. Marx shows that people first of all had to be forced to then he describes, for example, the enclosures movement in Britain, in England. This was sort of pulled by a new, as he says, a new generation of the gentry that had survived the wars, the fratricidal wars, and then sort of saw that there were these textile factories in Belgium that needed wool. And you could, sort of by driving the peasants from the land, replace them with sheep. And then the sheep sort of could be used to produce wool, and you could get money rather than the 10th or 20th part of, or 5th part of what the peasants were producing in their villages. You could, in other words, move to a money economy, partly with the money that had been taken out of the South American gold piles, where gold was never used for money. It was just used for sort of the people who looked at it and enjoyed it. And it was the Inca showed them his gold supply, whereas the Spaniards turned them into money. Yeah. So then he shows how. Then there is this sort of fantastic chapter about maximum wages and minimum working hours. After the great the plague, the Black Death, suddenly in England wages went up because there were fewer workers. It turned out, however, that these workers, once they had earned the same money as they had earned before the wage increase, let's say Friday evening, they went home, rather than continuing in order to make more money. They were happy with what they were used to. And then the king, in this case the first Elizabeth, had to impose both maximum wages and minimum working hours on the English economy. The absolute opposite, Marx says, of minimum wages and maximum working hours that the unions in the 19th century tried to get. Yeah. But this was to keep them working. There's an inverse labor supply curve behind this, which is that at a certain point, if you lower the wage, people work more rather than less because they need to feed themselves. Yeah. And then here comes where he sort of analyzes how violence slowly goes away and is replaced with a particular way of life, with a culture. The advance of capitalist production develops the working class, which by education, tradition, habit, looks upon the conditions of that mode of production as self-evident laws of nature. That's what we're doing. The organization of the capitalist process of production, once fully developed, breaks down all resistance. The dull compulsion of economic relations completes the subjection of the laborer to the capitalist. Direct force, outside economic conditions, is of course still used, but only exceptionally. There are no workhouses anymore. Nobody is anymore put to prison for vagabondage, as they were in the early 19th century, when they had to get used to working in the new way. In the ordinary run of things, the laborer can be left to the natural laws of production. That is, to his dependence on capital, a dependence springing from and guaranteed in perpetuity by the conditions of production themselves. I should think that this is one of the most enlightening, at least to me, one of the most enlightening chapters in this fascinating book. Let's go back here. No, I knew I was here again. No, yeah. So then, in the history of the work ethic, so to speak, this was written in 1867. One can now try to develop a catalogue of the ways in which the modern work ethic was maintained, in spite of the fact that in the Western countries, levels of prosperity were continuously rising. People kept working their butts off, although they were doing better with time. And then you can try to develop the welfare state, for example. Welfare state becomes a mechanism of making people work. If you don't work, you don't get what do you have? Pension, insurance, and so on. Trade unionism, promises of full employment, and a rising standard of living, the post-war situation. A better life for the next generation, and the idea of maybe a post-capitalist beyond. Now you would say nobody dreams of this, but I maintain everybody does. And in the following way, this became clear to me only a little time ago when I became a retired professor. Yeah? A capitalist is someone who doesn't have to work, who lives off capital, accumulated capital. Yeah? Of course, we will never be as rich as Abramovich or whatever these people are. But when we get retired, we suddenly get an income without having to work for it. Yeah? On the basis of what, more or less fictionally, we are said to have accumulated during our lifetime as our capital for the rest of our lives. Now, then, if you look at this, in Germany, for example, when Bismarck introduced the old age pensions, the average life expectancy of an industrial worker was exactly 65 years. And at age 65, you received a pension. So that wasn't cheap, that wasn't expensive for the state, because on average they were all dying by that time. Yeah? But now we're getting 20 years older. And then we get for 20 years something that we believe is our well-deserved, interest on our capital. Yeah. Testing this, how important this is, you only have to think about attempts to cut pensions. Because these pension systems are all now overblown. In Germany, I think one quarter of the federal budget goes into subsidizing the pension system. Yeah? If you wanted to actually either raise the age of retirement or lower the pension, you would be in very, very bad shape as a politician, like Macron. It is in American political jargon, Social Security, as they call it there, the old age pension, is the third rail. Now, if you've ever lived in New York, you know what the third rail is. The subway has two rails for the wheels, and then there's another rail in the middle, which is where the electricity comes from. And you should never hit, if you hit you're dead. Yeah? And the political wisdom is never hit the third rail, yeah? Because that ends your political life. But that's interesting. So I would think that this idea of being able to live without having to work for money is deeply present as a sort of pro-capitalist desire for the non-capitalists. Yeah? And if we were to do a theory of the subsistentialist temptation, which is let's just continue and we don't need more, then here is something where we can begin to think. Now, one other thing, suspending the subsistentialist temptation, is consumerism. Rising consumption norms, product obsolescence, innovation. And if there is anything that sort of is driving the present capitalist economy, consumer capitalism, then it's innovation. You have to innovate. You have to tell people that the bathroom that they have is no longer up to standards. They need a different bathroom. They need a Grohe shower, not just this old shower. And so and then financialization, consumer credit and debt bondage. I will say something on credit in a few minutes, but just to give you an example from my own research, something that sort of stuck with me for the rest of my life. When I was in America doing research on the automobile industry and how they were setting up new, smaller plants to be able to control the workforces better. Then near Wisconsin, I think it was General Motors was setting up a new plant for, I think, 1,000 workers at the beginning. And I went there to see how they selected these workers and talked to the manager, to the personnel manager. And they had 100,000 applications for the 1,000 jobs. And I said, why? What do you do? How do you find out who comes on the short list? Yeah. And then he said, well, first of all, we have some lists of union members, and they, of course, have no chance. I said, oh, okay, I can understand that. But what's next? And then he said, yeah, they need to be married and have children. I say, and what else? And and they need to have a mortgage. I said, naively, I said, why a mortgage? And he said, someone who has a mortgage to pay off will never go on strike. Yeah? Maintains the work ethic. Yeah? So that was quite debt bondage. And then, of course, the inverse labor supply curve. Austerity, lowering wages, can lead to a higher participation rate. Also indirectly, in the United States, wages have not increased, real wages have not increased since the 1970s. But what did increase is the participation rate, especially of married women. If the family income stagnates, then the family has to sell more labor to the labor market in order to increase its income, although the real income for the individual has declined. Yeah. All of these are mechanisms by which this temptation to sort of rest for a while can be fought. Yeah, here we were here now. Now, I will go to another of these contradictions and tensions, and locate them in the development of capitalist societies since the end of the post-war settlement. And I will not in detail outline what that settlement was. It basically rested on full employment policies, a growing welfare state, the very strong role of trade unions and collective bargaining, all with the fear that workers who had come out of the war empowered would otherwise turn to communist opposition or something like this. Yeah, in America, it was fairly clear that, for example, the American blacks had fought in the war in black. How do you say it? Companies, and there was the idea that they had learned to shoot. And so you had, they knew how to use guns. So you had to incorporate them into the welfare state. Generally, you can say that all these wars, the First World War and the Second World War, ended in all countries, the winners and the losers, with a strengthening of trade unions and social democrats. Among the winners, because workers came back from the battlefield and demanded a reward for them having fought for their country. The slogan was, we have so exposed ourselves and our lives, put our lives at risk, and now we want to have a better deal, new deal. In the loser countries, the elites, including the capitalists, were discredited. Something that very few people know is that in Japan after 1945, there were almost 80% trade union members, and there was even a socialist prime minister. The Socialist Party won the 1949 election until General MacArthur told them that this drove the democracy too far, and then that government was deposed, yeah, by the military, by the American military government. So since the end of this period, roughly in the late 1960s, governments had to come up with ever new ways of politically generating resources above and beyond what the capitalist economy made available. The problem was to enable capital to remain profitable and at the same time encourage labor to continue cooperating in the accumulation of privately owned capital. So that's a problem. The two things are not easily combined. Yeah? And then you can see how states, governments, indispensable for the stability of this regime, developed ever new ways from then on to solve this problem, to insert fictional resources into a distributive struggle which would have been, or might have been, fratricidal had it been limited to the resources that were available. Workers and unions were too self-confident at the end of the 1960s, for example, to agree to lower wages in order for profits to remain high. And I will show you how one can distinguish 5 periods in which states tried in different ways to secure cooperation between capital and labor, and thereby maintain social integration. And the trick is that the solutions found in each period worked only for a limited time until they became problems themselves, forcing new policy priorities and new solutions, abandoned as well after a time as their dysfunctions matured. Yeah? And here we go. We begin very sort of briefly, I can't walk you through the whole thing. We begin with the inflation state in the 1970s. The policy goal was full employment. The problem, labor militancy, hanging over from the 1950s and 1960s. The solution, political deals with labor. However, it resulted at the end in stagflation, in the sense that there was still inflation, but inflation discouraged investment. So for 10 years, roughly, this thing worked. And then with the American, in the 1970s, early 1980s, with the American high interest rate policy, the United States began to kill inflation in order to set in motion industrial restructuring for international competitiveness. The result was deunionization, but also public debt began to increase. You have a sort of like, how to say, communicating pipes system, where inflation goes down, public debt goes up, because the end of inflation meant high unemployment, deunionization, and very high costs of a welfare state that could not yet be cut down for political reasons. So public debt begins to rise until the mid-1990s, when creditors became concerned that states would not be able to repay their debt. Then you see from the mid-1990s to roughly 2008, the shift to what I call the consolidation state. The consolidation state meant basically globalization, restoration of creditor confidence, public austerity, deregulation of private debt, privatization, neoliberal welfare state reform. At this time, it was politically possible. But the result was financial instability, 2008. And you had this long series, as a result of the deregulation of finance, this long series of financial crises beginning in the mid-1990s, Asia crisis, and then 2008. In 2008, a new world begins, namely what I call the central bank fiat money state, which fights financial instability, tries to address the problem of secular stagnation, as Larry Summers called it, and the fear of debt deflation. The solution was monetizing state expenditures, low and negative interest rates, and the creation of money under, how do you say, quantitative easing. Yeah, we need to go back here. Result, asset price inflation, rising inequality, and after 2019, this whole thing sort of begins to show that the problems were not solved. Social stability becomes very much a concern, because we see this rising inequality, disintegration at the lower end of the scale, deglobalization beginning as supply chains break down. Supply side inflation begins, which even in 2019 we were told that inflation was completely out of the question. It could not return And what is the solution? Increased interest rates, but at the same time, in order to maintain social stability, cost of living subsidies, cost of producing subsidies, and rapidly growing public debt. Sorry for walking you so fast through this thing. You could spend an entire evening on it, but I try to make you understand that this is a sort of movement where ever new problems are created by the solutions sort of adopted for the old problems, and then and then you see that in spite of all these changes, perceived problems, in spite of changes in perceived problems, of applied solutions and new problems caused, growth kept declining, public debt kept increasing, private debt kept growing, same with inequality, while money production went rampant. And I will just show you a few things. Growth rates, sliding 5-year averages. We end here at 2019. In the last 2 years, you can imagine that the decline continued. Yeah? Public debt in 20 OECD countries in percent of GDP. And this starts in 1995 with the end of communism, goes to 27, but then with the world economic crisis, everything that was done in the consolidation state, which was to bring down public debt while offloading it to private debt, was completely wiped out, and now you are, and now with the response to COVID and the war, you can imagine how this will look in subsequent years. For example, in Germany, we now have a sort of cheating system, like this year 250 billion new debt, which is not counted as new debt, which is sort of stashed away in some special budgets. Yeah. Private debt. And you can see that in the 1950s, up to 1970, there was literally nothing like this. Households and non-profit. But now you see, since the 2008 crisis, sort of a little bit less, but after this, it again goes up. There are similar statistics about the household debt in the United States compared to the entire debt of the Chinese economy. It's basically similar. Yeah. Then I take this from Piketty. It's sort of pretty uniform for all major societies. We look at 1980 and 2010. 1980 is probably the point that, as Piketty shows, where wealth inequality is lowest since the end of the 19th century. But then there is exactly in this at this time, 2010, a change. From then on, it becomes worse, and you see that. For example, the United States, 46% of the wealth of the top 10 are held by the top 1. By the top 1. And it goes through all of these statistics. I've just taken a few from the Piketty book. You can enrich this in any possible way. At the same time, as public debt went up, private debt went up, growth went down, the central bank assets, that is the production of fresh money, fiat money, by the central banks buying up debt paper from either governments or firms, goes up absolutely unbelievably from 2007, where it was in the range of 10% $10 trillion now to 25 in very, very short year. This is the world, not the US. Advanced economies, it's even worse, as you see in the blue ones. And then the Federal Reserve is one of them. So since 2020, the trend is just unbelievable. Assets of 4 leading central banks in percent of GDP. The worst is the Bank of Japan. But the European Central Bank is fighting to catch up with Japan. Yeah. Broad money supply. We can always discuss what money supply means, but in terms of GDP, there's more and more money in the world. Partly it is sort of kept in some places where you don't know where it is. And what it does is it builds up liabilities. You have claims to something if you sit on them. So at some point, these claims will be presented. And here's my sort of final remark on this crisis sequence, the emergency state. 2 exogenous super crises find states exhausted and desperate. Hyperglobalization breaks down as supply chains break up due to institutional ungovernability and political fragmentation of the US-led New World Order. You could write this history in terms of 1990 begins this moment when the elder Bush announces a New World Order with the United States at the center. If you look at the history of this formation, now 3 decades, there's not a single year in which the United States were not at war. Not a single year. Yeah? And in 5 years ago, the arms spending of the United States was 150% of what it was at the high point of the Cold War, measured in constant dollars of 2020. Yeah? It's simply unbelievable what governments, how this sort of disorder is reflected in these horrendous statistics. The return of inflation, this time non-negotiable in the sense that the old inflation you could sort of call the trade unions in and the employers and make some sort of wage moderation deal. But that inflation is not caused by trade unions. It is caused by the shortened supply lines, partly because they were disorganized and not governable, partly because for military reasons we are now sort of fragmenting the world economy, with the result of course, increasing prices. And inflation coming back with austerity in a much more precarious society at the limits of fiat money production. Then, finally, now you read in newspapers interesting stories about people who have understood that the promise of rising prosperity in the future, if they only work hard enough, cannot be kept. Maybe for environmental reasons, maybe for reasons of the organization of the global economy. Now the question becomes, if the state can save me from COVID by sort of injecting 200, for example, I'm drawing an American pension from my time in the United States. And suddenly I had $1,200 in my post box, mailbox, because every pensioner in the United States 2 years ago, in order to make them feel better, got a check, 1,200. My wife also draws a small American pension. She also had $1,200. That money is simply sort of produced. There seems to be no limit anymore. Yeah, and similar in France, where where the government is scared stiff of the yellow vests. And then sort of they get, now in Germany, at the end of this year, the government will, in a very complicated process, pay the next installment of our gas bills. And so rich and poor, me, others, will not have to pay that installment because the government takes over. Yeah. And so on and so on and so on. So I think they are scared stiff, and the reports now can be read about people who begin to think not just that they could do with what they have. Now it is the point that they have learned that they can do with less, and that there is no prospect of them having more in the future. And suddenly you see sort of in many industries where workers are no longer to be found, because they think that with the new emergency help they can do without. Yeah? A new generation that has become much less environmental reasons, the reasons of economic prospects and so on. The capitalist nightmare of a subsistentialist temptation to spend less and work less, declining demand and declining labor supply, is now something that is maybe imagined, but it is on the horizon of economic policy making in many countries. Yeah, thank you very much. I hope that wasn't too fast, and I hope I could convince you, especially with the final overview on the main parameters of the national economies of advanced capitalism, that we are in for some pretty difficult time. The moment when those who own the debt papers want to get something for them, I don't know how we will pay them off. Thank you very much.
Dear Professor Streeck, I would really like to thank you for a challenging and thought-provoking lecture. It reminded me a little bit of the ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh had to go through 7 plagues before he changed his mind. But at least you ended with hopeful words that we might change our minds. So let's at least have a drink to cheer one another up, and then that also allows people to address you with any questions they might have. So thanks again for a great speech. Thank you.